Good evening. Good evening. You know, some stories in scripture thunder with miracles, burning bush moments, parted seas, walls collapsing at a shout. But Joshua chapter 22 gives us a different kind of drama, one that hits closer to home because it's not about conquering enemies, it's about misunderstanding friends. No giants, no Jerichos, just a rumor, a reaction, and a near civil war among the people of God. And that's the brilliance of this chapter. Israel had survived foreign nations, pagan kings, wilderness rebellions, and supernatural tests. But the biggest threat to their future wasn't an enemy on the outside, it was a suspicion on the inside. For the first time in Joshua, the danger isn't Canaan, the danger is each other. Sometimes the fiercest battles in the land of promise aren't fought with swords, they're fought with assumptions, misread motives, and half told stories. And this ancient moment echoes straight into our 2025 society, 2025 world. Churches fracture quicker than nations. Online mobs escalate faster than armies. One viral rumor does more damage than an actual attack. And Christians who preach unity often practice judgment and separation and division. Joshua chapter 22 becomes a mirror held up to a modern, polarized, easily offended, quick to assume, slow to listen church. It asks us, can the people of God actually live together once the war is over? Can we handle peace as faithfully as we handle battle? Because conquering land is one thing, but staying united in it is quite another. That takes another kind of courage. I'm so glad to be joined by Pastor Miles Young, hailing from North Carolina, and of course, Pastor Floyd White, who is making his debut on the podcast tonight. Gentlemen, I want to start off the discussion with this question. If Israel could trust each other enough to fight side by side for 7 years, why did they trust each other less in peacetime than they did in battle? And where do modern churches face this same paradox?
That's an excellent question. First, let me say, Pastor White, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you too, my friend. Good to be here.
Welcome. I think that's such a. You always have really good questions, Mike. And so on one side, they're fighting with each other for 7 years. They're trusting in each other. They're fighting back to back. I mean, they're seeing the terrors of war, and now that there is this peace. Perhaps there is now a fear of losing what has been gained. You know, it's this fear that, hey, if we do something wrong, if we go too far, we can now jeopardize what has been gained along the way. And it kind of takes me to what we're seeing in a lot of our churches where there's a generational divide that has gone through some evangelistic warfare. Man, they were knocking on doors, they were passing out tracts, they were preaching like they were at war. And they've gained so much ground in building and erecting these churches. And now we're dealing with a younger generation that sometimes wants to see some change, sometimes wants to do things a little differently. And it's like, we're not at war anymore. We're all supposed to be unified. And yet we see so much contention. And so from my perspective, I think that's where I would connect this in modern times.
Yeah. I like that. I was thinking too that sometimes people appear to be united because they have a common enemy. And it's easy. I mean, even if we don't get along, if we think that an enemy is out to get us, sometimes we come together for survival because we need that. But as soon as the enemy is no more present, then we become enemies. If you get me. And so that too is another aspect of why it is so easy to have unity when we have a common enemy, yet that unity becomes fragile and fragmented when the enemy is gone, which means unity cannot be hoisted on the fact that we fear that somebody is out to get us. Unity has to be hoisted on something more sustainable so that even in the absence of an enemy, we can still forge together.
That's good. I like that.
those are both excellent points. And what's interesting about this story is that, as we're going to get into this, as the conversation progresses, the disunity that we're going to see, the almost abruption of the relationship between the Western tribes and the Eastern tribes is all based on an assumption. It's all based on what the Eastern tribes presume is the motive and the intent of the Western tribes. Today in the church, we're as far apart, I believe, even in our denomination as Seventh-day Adventists, as folks in the world. We look at events in different lights. We could see the same set of facts play out and come across with the exact same polar opposite conclusions that folks in the world draw from. And so the question that I have is, why is that the case? Why is it that if we have the truth as our guiding light, if the Bible is the foundation from which we view everything, world events, politics, prophecy, why is it that when things happen, we're as polarized and as miles apart as folks in the quote unquote world?
The short answer, we're human just like anybody else. I mean, even though we have religious belief, the truth be told, let's be honest, we interpret everything based on our own upbringing or culture. The lenses that we interpret things through, they're so different. But there's something in psychology called negative bias. Sometimes we interpret things in the present because of negative experiences that we've had in the past. We tend to do that. And so there are so many things at play. And I don't want to sound like I'm taking a negative stance on this, because when God gets introduced to the picture, when we understand that we are seeing things through our own lenses, when we understand that the way how we look at something is not how somebody else looks at something. And I'm apologizing for bringing in the psychology aspect. There's a thing in psychology called fundamental attribution error. Okay, where human beings look on other human beings as simple. There's nothing complex about you, my brother. When I look on you, all I see is just what I see. Nothing. There's no layer to you. But we look on ourselves as layered and complexed. And so we interpret people's action as tied to their character. It's who you are. But when we do this very same thing, it's because of my circumstance, my situation, what's happening around the way I did all that. And if you only understood what I'm going through, you would understand why I did what I did. And so this is a lot that we have to deal with when it comes to interpreting things. Of course, our views are going to be different. Of course, we are seeing things differently. Of course, we are polar opposite when it comes to how we look on even the same topic, because of how we view people and how we view ourselves. And that is something that we have to grapple with from day to day.
But isn't that so much easier? Isn't it easier to just assume you're simple or you don't get it? Isn't it easier to just go and have a civil war than actually sit down and discuss and talk about people and talk to someone, get to know somebody?
Yeah, it is.
Mm-hmm.
It is.
Yeah, I think that's our first instinct. It's just easier for me to make assumptions, even if they're rooted in the correct things, because what one side believed that they were protecting the law of God. They believed they were doing the right thing. But the easier part is just saying, hey, what's going on? We just fought a war together. Let's not backslide. And all they had to do was take the opportunity for the other side to say, whoa, no, we're serving the same God. This is just a different perspective. And so I wonder why it's so easy for us to just, go to the extreme, make those assumptions instead of just sitting down.
As you were both speaking, I was thinking about how, Israel trusted each other more in war than in peace, because war simplifies loyalty. In battle, the enemy is external, visible, like you were alluding to, Pastor Miles, earlier. And the enemy is a shared enemy, like you were alluding to, Pastor White. Yeah. Everyone knows where to stand. Fear is organized. Sometimes there's certain uniforms and flags involved to help distinguish who is on your side. Allegiance is clear. There's no time for suspicion during times of war. Survival demands trust.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
become functional, and even if it's fragile. But peace does something different. Peace removes a sense of urgency. Peace creates space for interpretation, and peace gives people time to tell stories about each other. Peace gives people the luxury to entertain their prejudices. And once the swords are sheathed and the real conflicts begin, not other survival, but over meaning, not over survival, but over meaning. Um, that's what happens when we look at Joshua chapter 22. The moment the fighting ends, Israel starts asking the most dangerous question a community can ask. Who are you really loyal to? Do you still belong? Are you one of us or not? And,
Hmm.
and the Bible may be the church's foundation, but interpretation is this battlefield. People don't enter scripture as blank slates, like you were alluding to, Pastor White. They bring their
No.
tribes, they bring
No.
their political identities, they
Yeah.
bring cultural fear, culture wars. They bring their biases, they bring their
Yeah.
music preferences, they bring their dress preferences, they bring their food preferences to the table. And just like Israel, modern believers read behavior through the lens of past disasters.
Yeah.
Remember, Mhm.
It's interesting you said that. I'm sorry if I cut you off. You can finish, please.
No, I was just saying. Remember Achan? We discussed Achan not too long ago. Baal Peor, and then they assumed the worst before seeking understanding. And I know I bring this example a lot, but I think it's apt because Pastor Ivan Myers was just posing with a Muslim political candidate who expressed interest in Daniel Revelation, who expressed interest in his YouTube channel. And from the picture alone, he clarified and said, "I'm not endorsing a political candidate." He gave the backstory of the picture. He was doing an event in New York City in which he was asked to be the speaker, and the topic of discussion, the topic of his sermon was the separation of church and state. And so
Right.
they had politicians from both sides of the aisle. Pastor Myers, his wife, and the candidate, Zoran Mamdani, take a picture smiling together. Mamdani was actually there first. He came early and made a beeline straight to Myers. And you should see the floodgate of negative comments from believers, from people who call themselves Adventists. And what was amazing is that Myers came back on days later and said, Mamdani saw the comments. He saw the comments from the Adventists, and it was such an embarrassing moment for him because many of the comments were coming from a place of, how dare you endorse this communist? Don't you know what Muslims believe? And how dare you? Now, we would think that any opportunity we get to share the gospel or to come into contact with people who we can influence would be the same way many of those same voices applauded someone like Danny Shelton, arm in arm with Charlie Kirk this past March. But it's amazing that we see our clear political biases on full display, because no longer is the main objective ministry when it comes down to this particular person.
Mhm.
Now it's controversy. But when it's someone that I like, this is ministry. This is evangelism. But when it's someone I don't ideologically align with, now it's controversy. Now you've crossed the line, Pastor. Now you've caused chaos, and now we've got to reckon, and this hand wringing and gnashing of teeth. And it's amazing how so many people who call themselves people of the book, people who pride themselves in knowledge of the scriptures and prophecies, fall into this trap.
Mhm.
Because they're not looking through it through the lens of prophetic prophecy. They're not looking, how do I get someone saved? They're looking at it from, this is my team and that's your team, and how do I make it known that your team is bad, that your team is not in alignment, that my team is the more righteous one. And and we get so caught up in this thing. And Dr. Timothy Golden said a few weeks ago, this is not about left and right. This is about right and wrong. As you mentioned, Pastor Wright, we're humans. We have the right to vote, and we have the right to have our opinions. But when it comes down to spiritual things, those things really should take precedent and be the guiding factor through which all those other considerations are being considered.
I'm with you 100%. Spiritual things should really regulate how we operate, how we treat different situations. It is true. The human side of us that we grapple with all the time is that we're always trying to read people's motives. For some reason, we believe it is our prerogative to know what the other person's motives are. And it's the same thing in Joshua chapter 22. You can clearly see that the people from the West were trying to read the motives of the people from the East side, because they were interpreting, listen, these guys are about to commit idolatry. And they readied the army. Read the chapter. They readied the army, and they went down there just to confirm, if this is what they are up about, we are going to just get rid of them, and that's the whole thing. That's where we have reached. We are looking beyond people's actions, and we are not willing to do the work, or to do the hard work, to try to find out what are the situations surrounding what people do. We are ready to, in just one glance at something that somebody did once, we are ready to read up their motives and say, this is why he did that, this is why she did that. And you're right, the altar is now something new in the 21st century. What's the altar? The altar is somebody's dress. The altar is somebody taking a photo, as you said, with somebody else. That's the altar. We have concluded that's what that's all about. And we are ready to judge the person because we think we know what their motives are. And that is a major challenge that we have when we have moved from what we can see to what we cannot see and what we cannot determine. That's a problem, not just for others, but for us too.
I want to welcome Pastor Curran Jones to the conversation. When we look at human behavior, as we've been discussing, humans are always quicker to assume rebellion than to assume faithfulness. Isn't that the case? Humans are always willing to assume rebellion rather than faithfulness. And this is the case, if we look at the history of the church, when I say the Christian church in general, I mean, going back to Martin Luther, right? When Martin Luther is going through his reckoning with what it means to be sanctified in Christ, whether or not there's a need for intermediary in the form of a priest, when he starts exposing the truth to the people who were not able to read the scriptures for themselves because it was not in their language.
Right.
They called him a heretic. They called him a rebel. They were willing to, burn him at the stake. And, I believe it was in 1621 at the Diet of Worms. He goes toe to toe with the leading religious minds of the day. And if you read the book, The Great Controversy, you see that there was nothing they could say in response to every point of scripture that he brought up, to the point where all they could say was recant.
Yeah.
Just
recant.
down, just recant. And then when I fast forward to today, I see the same spirit in many people who profess to be experts in the Bible, experts in theology, when they are confronted with the hypocrisy of their own political ideology and how it doesn't align seamlessly with the way Jesus Christ was on this earth. You see people who want to force religion into classrooms, force religion into courtrooms in the form of the Ten Commandments being on the wall for display. But those same people don't want the Ten Commandments to be on on their heart. When the two greatest commandments was love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. Those are left at the wayside when it comes down to welcoming the stranger, to clothing the naked, to feeding the hungry, and to looking out for the least of these. Those considerations are ignored because we want the posturing of having the symbolic showing and that this is a Christian nation, to living up to what it means to be Christian. What are your thoughts, Pastor Jones?
No, I mean, I agree. I was just, agreeing with my brother. We was talking about, sometimes we make assumptions, but we don't do the groundwork of knowing what people really are, and sometimes we, jump to motives and things like that. And so we just, we have to be careful. And that's why it's important for us, to get close to people, to ask questions, to find out, what's really behind why people are doing certain things. And sometimes we can, we'll be shocked by the answers that we get. And I'm sure, like the children of Israel, again, when they were banded up, they were like, let's go to war. When they inquire, like, hey, what's going on? Well, hey, this is the reason we're doing this. Far be it. We're just trying to make sure that y'all remember us, when it's time to come. So, I think it's just so many lessons there, about being careful how we draw conclusions, or even make assumptions, even again in the political realm, right? People can make assumptions that people are here, but they're really not there, and so we just have to be careful on that. And so, yeah, I thought that was really good.
And in that same vein, how does our digital culture, instant reaction, zero context, constant outrage, reinforce the tendency to assume rebellion than to assume faithfulness?
Yeah, I think we jump to conclusions really fast about everything. And I think we find out, and just like that, we find out like, oh, we didn't see the first part where A, B, and C happened. All we saw was this, and so sometimes we demonize, we counsel people, we do all kind of things to people, not realizing that the story is totally different from what we assumed on social media. So social media is a very big place for that. I mean, we jump to assumptions, we, all kind of things, before we even know the whole full story. And sometimes people have to backtrack, they have to backtrack on the things because, they made one statement and people just took it and ran with it. But we found that it's a different story. So.
And let's be honest, some people don't want the full story because what what they see or what they assume to see confirms their own bias. A lot of times, especially with social media, algorithms feed us what we are prone to stop and read and stop and agree with and share and like. And so we approach life that way, right? We cut people off. We dismiss them altogether because we take something that they've said and say, oh, is that what you meant? And we run with that and say, this is what we take them out of context. We don't stop to actually give them the benefit of the doubt. We don't stop to consider their motives. What's interesting about the story and the lesson is that the Western tribes had the spiritual maturity to look past the current offense that they could have had and say, okay, what is it that what's the real core of what it is that the Eastern tribes are getting at? Oh, they're against idolatry. They're afraid that idolatry is going to creep back into Israel. Okay, don't worry. We're going to assure them. We're going to give them assurance that we are also in alignment with their stance against idolatry because we want unity between us. And so many times we don't have that maturity as Christians. We don't have the maturity as a body of people because we want to we want our biases to be confirmed.
Yeah. Projecting hurt. They weren't responding to what was happening then. They were responding to what happened in the past. They approached it because what happened, we are not allowing that to repeat. And I guess they were thinking about, they didn't want it to be repeated because they were thinking about what could have happened when we read, is it Numbers 25? Yes, Numbers 25. Remember that God was about to punish the entire camp. And they were looking on it from that perspective to say, if we allow this idolatry to happen, if we allow them to go down this path, not only they're going to be destroyed, we too are going to be implicated in all of this. So we need to put a stop to it. And that's how they were now projecting something that happened in the past and trying, and this was 40 years ago, of course, but they were trying to project that on what was happening in the present. And that can be very dangerous too.
Yeah, I think this is a good lesson, for even conflict resolution. I think that, because sometimes we jump to conclusions about what a person is doing, what they're planning, or they're trying to undermine, they're trying to do this, but it's always good to know for sure, and I just think about, going back to the political climate that we're in today, where you see certain political parties don't want to know the truth, right? They want to make these assumptions. They want to call these things out. They want to say, oh, this is this and that, and let it stay there and then put more fire into everybody else, right? And so, these are these were, God's people who are willing to work together, they're willing to understand, okay, I see what you're doing. Okay, now I understand, okay, oh, I see, this is just a witness, as opposed to trying to cause civil war, right? And they didn't want necessarily that. If it had to be that way, if there was an issue, we would, but we're not trying to make that happen, right? We're not looking for ways, to make that happen, right?
Yeah.
And I think that, even the political climate we're in now, we're dealing with situations where people are trying to impose things or trying to fire up, for the demise. So yeah, it's very good.
If I could jump in, I can't help but think that empathy could have, really shifted how this whole thing played out. And I think connecting that back to our digital culture, if we look online, we are fundamentally lacking empathy. We are very quick to jump to assumptions. We're very quick to assume that the person on the other side of this Instagram post, Twitter post, whatever, is our enemy, that I have to be right and I am willing to do and say whatever is necessary to prove that I'm right. And I think that even, earlier we were connecting this idea of this altar, this witness, back to say dress preference in the church. I think if we had an empathetic approach to ask the questions, to say, why are you building this altar? What is this about? Why are you dressing down? What is this about? It should lead us to ask those questions to understand that this was never about insulting God. It was because they could not afford the clothes, because they want to connect with more people, because they don't want church to be a fashion show. And so I wish that we could, as a church, have a bit more empathy. But what are your thoughts on it?
No, Pastor Miles, I think you hit a perfect note, because I'm reminded of this movie that came out last year called Civil War. And if you've seen any trailer of this movie, it was a very, a very eerie movie, I guess, is to say the word, because the movie is set in the future. They don't give a specific year, but it's not, like that far into the future. In fact, you could see many elements of modern society playing out into this movie. There are people who are entrenched in their own political ideologies, their own news bubbles, and it metastasized into a point where the United States is at war with itself again in the modern era. Not in the era of horses and bayonets, but in the era of missile strikes, drone strikes, serious warfare, machine guns, and all kinds of things, thermal heating equipment to fight at nighttime, and the movie was a very it wasn't a feel good movie, because there was a lot of bloodshed throughout this film. But the point of the movie was to convey that the United States in its current state is not too far off from getting into something like this. You hear people saying, well, the United States has never been as divided. And then you have some people who say the world has not been as divided as it has been in current years, in recent years. So I say all that to kind of bring it into the church by saying that same mentality where people assume that if you, for instance, have a certain culture, have a certain preference of music, and that music does not align with a stoic Eurocentric style, then you're a rebel. Then you're not someone that's trying to conform. You're someone that's not converted. Or, if you, instead of wearing traditional suit and tie, wear a traditional garb, or whatever the case may be, then that doesn't allow you to kind of be in conformity outwardly with everyone else. That's an outward showing of your rebellion. And then even you, I think Pastor Miles alluded to how you even just wore jeans, and that was taken as a sign of disrespect. Being that you're from the West Coast, and there are people who are more conservative in the Bible Belt who may have saw that as just a sign of, where are you trying to take this church, Pastor? What's going on? And so we assume that, because this is not in alignment with the way I would do things, with what's comfortable and familiar to me, that you're obviously trying to rock the boat with negative intention. And there's a lot of animosity that people have towards efforts of inclusion. DEI has become a negative term for some reason. It's become a buzzword. Some folks don't even know what the letters stand for. But when you actually say it out loud, it says diversity, equity, include. Why would we be opposed to that when the gospel is not for any Jew nor Greek, male nor female, right? And so a lot of times, we bring our biases and we equate them to what the Lord wants. And when we bring it up to that level, it's easy for us to demonize and make an enemy of anyone who represents something that's different. And it's not unique to just our church. We're seeing it all throughout the different Christian denominations, and it's a very eye-opening thing. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I got a whole lot of thoughts. I can help but look into the comments, and I saw someone, as we were discussing that the idea is, stop it. Pastors are showing up in the pulpit on Sabbath and cut down jeans. I think that means ripped. I'm not sure. And a T-shirt. Wise up, brothers. But I mean, if we take the lesson that Scripture is saying, we're on one side, they're looking at this altar being built, and they're saying they are disrespecting God. We need to go kill them. We need to tear them down. We need to go and whoop them. If we, as we're saying, have an empathetic approach, not make assumptions, sit down, listen, and ask, what is behind this? Because hey, these are pastors. Perhaps, if we don't assume, perhaps behind their actions, there is actually love. There is actually Christ-centeredness. What could be on the other side of those actions? And so I think in approaching those comments, why can't we pause to say, what is on the other side of this? Are they trying to disrespect God, or is there a greater purpose? I hope I answered the question.
I think excellent point. And to the point that you were raising earlier, Pastor Jones, in terms of how people are just willing to just take a clip or take one kind of statement and run with it. You see YouTubers, you see these YouTubers making their whole living based on that. They take a clip from a sermon that sounds a little controversial here, and the clip was designed to get your attention because they would tie it into a biblical principle that no one could really disagree with. But they won't focus on that part. They'll focus on the part that raises your eyebrows and get a whole following to get riled up with them and to demonize people of the God, ministers and pastors and people who are spreading the word of God. And there is a kneecapping of the work of the gospel by these folks. And it's so effective that they're more effective inside doing that damage than anyone on the outside. And so another point that was raised was, taking something and not listening to folks. There's so many times that I heard people who would defend folks who made a living saying things that were diametrically opposed to the Beatitudes, diametrically opposed to the gospel, and say, no, you didn't listen to the full context. But no matter what the context, it's still diametrically opposed to the word. It's still diametrically opposed to the character of Christ. Well, you didn't listen to the full context of the beast. Right? He focused on the lamb-like characteristics. He sounds soft-spoken and he sounds reasonable, and look at how he looks like someone you'd want to invite over for dinner. But the speaker and the message and the content of their message consistently is diametrically opposed to the Christ that was all for, making sure that those who are taken advantage of, those who are overlooked, those who are poor and stepped on, actually are prioritized and taken care of. There's so many people who rush to the defense of a self-avowed white Christian nationalist named Charlie Kirk saying, brother, you didn't listen to the full context. If you could only see what I see, if you could only hear what I heard, then you'll see for yourself. And I'm using this as an example. There are many others, but I use this as an example, being that it was fairly recently. And you're like, okay, well, I'm waiting for there to be some kind of powerful moment that clarifies all of the hatred he spread, but it's never coming. So I think, in addition to what we're saying in terms of making sure that we're contextualizing and giving people the full benefit of the doubt. We're also to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. And if the consistent record is saying something, to deny that makes no sense at the same time. But the Eastern tribes listen before speaking. The Eastern tribes listen before speaking, and I think that was raised by you, Pastor Young. And let's be honest, that's a rare thing to have in 2025, listening before speaking. And we've talked about a lot of things on a grand scale, but even in relationships, you know, how many friendships have experienced turbulence because, you know, there was an assumption and people spoke before they actually were listening to the other person. How many marriages would actually be repaired, or how many dating relationships would actually get stronger if people were able to listen before speaking? What would our churches, families, and group chats look like if listening became a spiritual discipline rather than a lost art?
I want to push it even further though, because it's one thing to say you're going to listen, but it's another thing to create brave spaces where others are free and privileged to speak. You know, because I don't think we do a good enough job of letting people know, not only do I want to hear from you, but perhaps change can come about when you actually do speak up. But to answer your question directly, I think we can do incredible things if we actually paused and listened, and you really stood with people in the midst of their feelings, their emotions, in the middle of their actions. You know, what would it look like? And instead of you know, just to pick low-hanging fruit as an analogy, what if that church that kicked a young girl out because she got pregnant outside of wedlock? What if instead of kicking her out, they sat with her, they asked her what she needed? They actually were there with her, listening to her, being with her. How might her trajectory in the church have changed? So I think it's valuable. I think it's necessary to listen, to create those brave spaces where people can speak, and to be with people in the midst of that.
Yeah, if I may chime in on that, I'm totally with that. I am fascinated with Joshua chapter 22, because the Eastern tribe, they were listening in the face of accusation. Okay, I mean, and that's not easy. We can talk about listening, but when somebody's accusing you, your initial response usually is to defend yourself. I mean, why would you just sit there and allow somebody to say something that you know is not true? And when you know it's not true, you really want to let them know, hey, you're wrong. You are definitely wrong. They did not react. They listened. And I mean, this is something that I think all of us as Christians, we must try to make a part of our daily lives. We need to listen. Even when we're being accused, we must not react, because, you know, when we listen to others, we get time to process or response. I don't want to say reaction or response. We take time to process, to balance our emotions, you know, to calm our nervous system down before we start speaking. And when we do speak, when we don't give them what they expect, because people expect a fight sometimes. When they come to you, they expect a fight. And when you don't give them that fight, that alone makes them start thinking, hey, what's happening here? Why aren't you reacting the way others normally react? So I love the story, definitely, in Joshua chapter 22. They waited, they listened, and their response changed the trajectory of a civil war. It could have ended in a huge war, but because of how they responded, they listened first and responded, it changed everything. And I think if we do that, you talk about social media, that would cool down a little bit because it's fiery. I do not like to post in social media anymore, because it doesn't matter what you say. It's going to be taken out of context. It's going to be taken in a negative way. And what happens on social media is not necessarily discussions anymore. Sometimes in our churches, we are not having discussions anymore. No, we're having attacks. People are attacking people rather than what they actually said. So I can say something, and rather than you dealing with what I said, you launch a ad hominem attack on me. It's no me, Don't listen to that guy. He's gay. Why would you listen? No, I'm sorry I said that. But people attack people rather than what they say. Who cares what I might have done in the past? Who cares what I might be doing now? Deal with what I just said. Is there any truth in that? And if there is truth in that, let's talk about what I said. Deal with the subject at hand, the issue, and don't attack people.
That's so powerful, because there's so many people who would exemplify what we're discussing in terms of the gospel. Matthew 25 tells us to watch out for the stranger, for instance, advocate for the widow, the fatherless. And there are folks who would say, based on the fact that it's a Muslim saying to do these things, we shouldn't listen to him. But it's like, dude, we're not saying anything about his religion. We're saying, just, in this isolated moment, who is exemplifying this more, right? By his actions, and I think it's important because there's some videos that circulate on social media these days of people doing social experiments in public places like grocery stores or libraries, where unassuming people end up interacting with someone who may look rough around the edges. They may have their hairstyle in a certain way that makes them clutch their purse, or, that their dress code is not something that they're in alignment with, or familiar with, or culturally accepting. And so that person may approach them, and the person looks like they're tensing up, they're being abrasive, they're getting ready to kind of say something or defend themselves or do something to kind of get into an antagonistic state of position. But the person then disarms them by doing something kind, like giving them a rose, or even giving them some cash or money or a compliment. And all of a sudden the guard comes down. And in some moments, some people are just confused, like, that's not what I was expecting. And I don't know how to react now, because I was expecting to really have a controversial moment that confirmed my bias against this person. What's interesting about this lesson is that Proverbs 15:1 says, a wise word turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. And I thought about that text, especially in today's climate, as you both mentioned, where things are so politically charged. People are on edge. People are they're ready to take things personal. They're ready to assume that you mean something negative. I remember one time when I, was just making conversation with someone, and we were talking about exercising. And I said, oh, I didn't know you would work out that way. But I didn't mean it in any kind of negative way. I was really just trying to engage. And they took it in a completely different way and started to throw an insult at me. And I realized what they must have experienced someone else before me saying something negative about them or saying something critical to them. And they brought that past trauma, they brought that past hurt, and they threw it onto me at that moment. And, when you look at the Western tribes, they react because they remember Baal Peor. How often do we project past trauma, church hurt, as we often call it, or unresolved wounds onto situations that don't deserve it? How do we present yesterday's pain, or how do we prevent yesterday's pain from dominating today's relationships?
Interesting question. And I put something to you. The text, the fifth commandment, honor thy father and thy mother. If you quote that commandment to somebody who had loving parents, it's one of the most beautiful texts, because the person thinks about, my dad and my mom, they have done so much for me. You quote that text to someone who was abused by their parents and they went through hell with their parents, and you quote that text to them, honor thy father and thy mother, you get a total different response, because the person is somehow carrying that trauma into their present world. And it's difficult to get over that trauma. You need healing to get over that trauma. You need to see the world as a bigger place to get over that trauma. And so people really need time to do that. People really need time to do that. And for us, I mean, everybody has something that is negative, that they carry with them, and the beautiful thing about uh, church and relationships and God and God talking about forgiveness and the Bible and all of that, you can get transformation from your trauma. You can get healing. It happens over time. It's not like a one time and you get over it. It's a process, really. But you can get that healing. And so we have got to be patient with people because they're getting over their trauma, right? We have got to be understanding of them. And the point I was making, we have got to start thinking of people as complex human beings with many layers. And we must take the time to understand that there are many things surrounding people that would make them do the things they do. And so we have got to try to be a little bit more understanding. I did not say we should excuse bad behavior, because some persons will come with some very bad behaviors. But it gives us the handle where we can understand that what they're doing is not necessarily linked to their character, but what they're doing might be as a result of their situations and their circumstances. And it helps us to give them a little bit more understanding to know where they're coming from so we can better help them rather than judge them.
No, I think those that was excellent. And when I look at the church, even when I was going through this lesson, I couldn't help but think of the racial divide that we've been experiencing and that we've constantly been in denial of as an organization, going back for generations. Ellen White was trying to address this, and she got to the point where she says, the Lord will show us some other way, and Dr. Jason O'Rourke said there is no other way. He said that on this platform, and he's right. There is no other way. We have to, we have to be spiritually mature enough to acknowledge that there's a problem, first of all. And we have to understand that, punting to the next 10 years and 20 years is not a strategy. There has to be some honesty. There has to be some looking in the mirror. And what's interesting about this lesson is that it's a call for both sides of the equation to conduct a self-evaluation. It's so easy to say this side needs to do this and this side needs to do that. But when we start looking at what we can do to kind of bridge the divide, then it becomes more humbling, and we start to, be a little bit more forgiving, or we extend a little bit more grace to those who are on the other side, right? And so, bringing past trauma, let's face it, as a people, I don't think there's any other people on the face of the planet that has faced trauma like African Americans. I don't think, and if anyone disagrees, I encourage them to, produce any kind of answer that would suggest otherwise. But think about it: the trauma of lynching, the trauma of segregation, the trauma of Jim Crow. It irritates me when people say slavery was over such and such amount of years ago. Get over it, because that's my next question is, okay, well, how long ago was police brutality? How long ago was redlining? How long ago was how were the economic disparities that lock people out of certain opportunities in the workforce and in living conditions? And so I just bring all that to say that we can bring the past trauma as a collective group, and we can start to treat our white brethren in a certain negative way based on that trauma, and assume that they are, in support of the status quo continuing. And on the flip side, many of the white brethren could say, based on the fact that, we've had a certain kind of, system where, we were calling the shots and everyone else was kind of in the background. And now it seems like there's kind of a disruption to that. You're maybe you're trying to be rebellious, So it takes both of us to look at ourselves and have the spiritual maturity to say, here's where we have a blind spot. Here's where we have some kind of work to do. And this is where the other side is coming from. Putting ourselves in the other person's shoes is a crucial element to understanding this week's lesson. But as we, move along, Israel missed the altar, assuming idolatry where there was actually insecurity. So what altars do we misread in our own community? Dress, worship style, political affiliation, silence, success, failure. What altars do we misread in our community?
You said them, man. Everything. Someone can even make just a comment on something, and it becomes an altar. The way we dress, the friends we associate with, everything that somebody thinks, okay, that looks like they're going against God. That's an altar. I mean, and they read behind your actions, of course. We got to remember this. Motives. It's not sometimes it's not just the action, it's the motive that people ascribe to your action. So if a young lady comes with a skimpy dress, she's just looking for attention. That is not okay. She doesn't have any clothes. Let me go and get her some clothes. Let me go and take her to the store so we can get some clothes for her. It's more like she's looking attention. She's trying to take away the married lady's husbands, kind of thing. Of course, she's going to get aggression, because if you link somebody's action to their character and you deem it to be bad, then of course you're thinking the person is bad. If the person is bad, why would you give the person any benefit of the doubt? You have already concluded that that person is just evil. So every emotion that you generate towards that person is going to be continually evil until you change how you see that person. The negative, as you said, the empathy. How will the empathy come if you see the person as just a bad person? Whatever the person does, it's characterological. Everything is linked to the character. The person is just bad. You will never have empathy towards somebody who you deem is just bad. But if you saw the person in a different light, then empathy becomes very easy.
Yeah, the story I thought about was when Jesus, was with Simon, and Mary Magdalene started to, basically wash his feet, right? And he was like, if he was really a prophet, he would have known this woman was a profligate woman, and he was just going in, and it's, and Jesus was like, let me ask you a question, Simon, if a debtor gave somebody this much and that much, which one, and then he was like, the one who forgave most. And then, he started going down and really digging into him about, this woman loves more because she's been forgiven more, and those kind of things. And so I think that's a place where, he was making an assumption, and she was not trying to be fresh. She was worshiping Jesus, and he took it as something different. Oh man, if he knew who this woman was, he would not let her touch his feet, But he was like, this woman is worshiping me, man. This woman loves God with all her heart, soul, and mind. You, on the other hand, don't love God, and that's why you are in the condition you're in. So you're blinded. So I think that's a perfect example of how we can't be judgmental. And I just have to wonder, how many of us are doing the same thing like Simon. We're judging people that God is approving of, right? And we're making these assumptions. And Jesus totally would flip the script. He was like, these people going to be in heaven, these people not, and then he would say something like, except your righteousness exceed the righteousness scribes and Pharisees, you won't enter. And they're like, I mean, these people are righteous. He's like, no.
Yeah.
And so we make all these judgments. And I think, it's funny because that's the type of society that the Bible says that we're actually going to live in the last days, where people will begin to have that spiritual pride and arrogance, and even we have to be careful as an Adventist church, because the church of Laodicean, rich and increase of good, have need of nothing, but you don't know that you're poor, wretched, blind, naked, all these kind of things. So we have to even be careful, as we're told in Revelation, that we have to be careful about making these assumptions, about people's characters and these kind of things, So, but I just thought about that story about, when we just try to figure out what other people's motives are, but we're not really in tune with the Holy Spirit. And it goes back to that same example.
Yeah, that's excellent. And inherent in what you were saying was we need to be careful that we don't have this presumption that we have a safeguard or a monopoly on what holiness is, or connection to Christ. The way in which Mary Magdalene exemplified her appreciation was totally not in alignment or was in contradiction with the style of the Pharisees. And when we look at some people who are more expressive in church, when we look at certain instruments that are not designed to keep a stoic and very cathedral like atmosphere. There are people who would be quick to condemn those things and say, any kind of expression of animation or any kind of drum set or anything like that is violently against anything that pertains to heaven. I remember Pastor Wright someone said to him, Pastor, that wasn't heavenly. Whatever, I guess someone sang in the church, and I guess the genre, or not the genre, the style of choice of music, even though it was a music that pointed to Christ, they didn't agree with. And he said, that wasn't heavenly. And he says, really, you've been to heaven? And so we got to be careful, because, who are we to actually make this assumption that we understand what it is? Now, of course, God does have standards. We're not trying to say anything otherwise, but we understand that to assume and to presume that we are the gatekeepers of what is holy, that is also something that we want to stay away from. So, you touched on some altars, Pastor Jones, the altar of worship style, the altar of dress code that you alluded to, Pastor White. You have the altar of political affiliation. We were talking about that earlier. Look at the rich young ruler. I believe if the rich young ruler were alive today, he would say, I believe in a flat tax rate. He would probably style himself as a fiscal conservative, being that he's in a certain tax bracket. And because of that, he could not bring himself to sympathize or to do away with that status and join the cause of Christ. And so many of us would fall into that same category. We grew up in the church. We grew up with the biblical knowledge. But when it comes down to it, there's such a stranglehold that our political affiliation, that our current status, economic status has over us, that when God gives us clear instructions to leave what we have and to follow him, it's impossible for us to do it. And so that is also something that could be an altar, right? And as we conclude, I want to also close off on this question, because let's face it, we alluded to Proverbs 15:1 earlier, but look, we're in a world of clapbacks. We're in a world of subtweets and outrage algorithms. If you say something to me, I'm going to say something back. There are artists who get into these lyrical battles with one another, and we get all invested. There are people who are sitting in seats of Congress where you see them go viral because they clap back and said, you know what, how dare you come at me when you got a bleach blonde butch, you fill it in. And so in a world built on clapbacks, outrage, and things of that nature, what does it look like to practice Proverbs 15:1? Proverbs 15:1, of course, says a wise word turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. What does it look like to practice Proverbs 15:1 without becoming passive or silent, or being looked at or being characterized as weak?
Something.
What's your end game? Sorry, go ahead, man.
No, go ahead.
My question is, what's your end game? Who are you trying to please? I mean, who's your audience here? If your audience are people, and those are the person you're trying to please, then we know how your clapbacks will sound. It will definitely be brutal. Try to attack people, try to win the argument, try to come out on top. Okay, you can. But if you are thinking about something better, like winning people, if you are thinking about something better, like being an example, if you're thinking about something better, and that's not weak in my estimation, to be honest with you, because look at how Jesus operated. He didn't say a lot, but when he said what he had to say, he got to the heart of the matter. Like in the situation with the woman caught in adultery, they were trying to trap him. I mean, what was his ultimate objective? To save the woman and to preserve her life and to give her another chance. And so his rhetoric went along that line. I believe there are times when we might need to respond, but it shouldn't be a situation where we're trying to go toe to toe with people. We're trying to win an argument. We're trying to prove that we are more savvy and we are more intelligent. That should never be the end game. The end game should always be to exemplify how real Christians operate, to demonstrate that we do not have to go toe to toe with people to do what they're doing, to attack them, that they are attacking us. We can always take the high road. That's just my way of looking at that.
I think about that quote from Michelle Obama: "When they go low, we go high." And since that quote was spoken at the Democratic National Convention in 2016, so many people have said, no, things have gotten so bad, we can't afford to go high. You know, when they go low, we dig even deeper. And let's face it, it's tempting. You know, we've seen just the nature of discourse in this country take such a plummet in such a short amount of time. I remember when there was a streak of instances where there were fights breaking out on airlines. You know, who remembers that? I mean, and not just in airlines, but in grocery stores. You know, and I think about the Texas, the love of men will wax cold, right? The hearts of men will wax cold as we get into the last days. And so in that environment, when we're called to give a wise word that turns away wrath, that's a tall order. Pastor Young.
Oh, I'm learning a bit about anger. You know, I think we can definitely come across a lot of things, especially in this current climate, that make us mad, make us angry. And I'm learning that anger, the idea of anger is to alarm you, set off the alarm bells that a boundary has been crossed. But I think instead of using anger as that alarm, we use it as our weapon. So I think if we just take a moment to recognize I'm mad because I'm seeing ICE agents strip away families and children. I'm mad because I'm seeing people use the Bible as a bully pulpit. You know, I'm mad. You know, if we use that as the alarm, but don't use our anger as the weapon, I think it allows us to still be mad and move in empathy. Whereas, as Pastor Wright was saying, at the end of this, I do want to see you transform. I do want to see you change. But I cannot be passive about this because my anger is telling me that a boundary has been crossed, a wrong has been done that does need to be addressed.
Corrected.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because we have this idea that to say nothing, to throw our hands in the air and say God will handle it. That's the Christian way. But when we look at Christ, we see that he was, you know, there's a be angry and sin not. He exemplified that, right? You know, sometimes, you know, we go from either extreme, either do nothing or be super angry and super militant and get in people's faces. And so human nature likes to bounce between extremes, whereas God can say, look, you know, we can call out wrong. We can use our anger, our righteous anger, as fuel for our action, as fuel and motivation for us to continue to be consistent and very careful in how we represent Christ and the amount of power we have to convey to others what it is to be a Christian. I think that's probably the best way to kind of be angry, but not cross the line into getting into, you know, becoming what you are opposing, you know, because that's a very fine line that a lot of people don't understand, you know.
Yeah. And I think it depends on what you're trying to protect, right? If you're trying to protect your own ego and pride, then that's one thing, right? But if you're trying to protect somebody else from injustice or being manipulated, that's another thing. So, you know, when you see Jesus, you know, he's not trying to protect his own pride of, you know, who he is and prove something to somebody. Like, let me show you who I really am. That's no, when he flips tables, he's flipping tables because people are being manipulated. People are being, you know, cheated. They're being frauded. You know, his father's house is being, you know, desecrated by thieves, you know, who are charging exorbitant prices for sacrifices, and people can't even afford to bring a sacrifice to the temple to worship God. So they were interfering with people's relationship with God. So that's, I think, our own, when I can't get mad about my own ego and my own pride, because I'm supposed to die to Christ, right? But when I see the cause of God being, misused or mishandled, that's when I step in, and like Martin Luther, I'm finna nail 95 theses on these walls right now, all 95. Y'all for yourself, and so that's the difference.
I'm glad you brought up that story, because so many people would take that and say, no, Jesus flipped tables because the worship environment wasn't right. Jesus flipped tables because people were, disrespecting the pews and the physical structure of the building. But Jesus was upset based on what the church was being used for, which was to continue and to extend the system of inequality. At the cross, we're all level. The church is the one place where the billionaire and the pauper can go, and both of them sit on the same pew as equals. When the professor who gave you that hard time all throughout the week and the student who's flunking at the bottom of the class sit at the same exact footing of the cross. But here it is, but they were using the church as an extension of an unjust system. And I see the church being used as an extension of an unjust system today. So many people are using the pulpits as microphones and platforms to confirm and affirm evil, to affirm what Pastor Miles Young was talking about, with people being stripped out of classrooms, out of places of worship, out of businesses, out of their employment offices, and shipped off to faraway lands. They're affirming the idea that billionaires should be able to ride on the backs of working people who have to choose between prescription medication and food. And that is evil. That's wrong. No one can look at that and say there's righteousness in that. And so, as we're concluding, I thought that parallel was apt. But, as we are drawing to a closing, we see that Joshua 22 ends not with bloodshed, but with relief. No swords drawn, no tribes erased, no civil war. Just something far rarer in scripture and in modern life. People listening long enough to realize they were wrong. That's the quiet miracle of this chapter.
Yeah, and I think that's powerful, and because in the future, of course, you run into a different issue in Judges when a woman is basically raped and dismantled, and of course, then that's righteous indignation on the tribe of Benjamin, and they try to talk, but they didn't want to talk. But anyway, you see the different responses. But in that case, they listened, they resolved it, they came together, they were unified. So that's what we do.
And what's scary is that a lot of people rather hold on to their own biases and political preferences and the way of viewing the world, even when all the evidence is presented against it, because there's too much pride to admit that you're wrong. I think that is a scary thing, because look at folks who understood that Jesus Christ was the manifestation of the prophecies of Isaiah. They had the evidence, right? So most will say, well, if Jesus was alive today, I would have definitely been following him. Well, all of the benefits were given. I mean, they had everything they needed to confirm this is who he said he is who he said he was. And yet there are people who are too prideful to believe, or to bring themselves to believe. And we can make the same mistake today. Some of us have held on to this false image of Christ, so that when something like a scripture or a sermon or something shakes up that idea, we reject it instead of actually looking at whether or not this is coming from a legitimate place, whether or not this is found in the scripture. No. Because we rather be right. We rather hold on to what's familiar than to actually be in alignment with what's correct. Any other thoughts as we conclude?
It takes a level of maturity to really step out of your comfort zone, to accept things that are not familiar with things that you have held all your life. It takes maturity. Most of us, we think we have arrived. We think we're it. We think we've got it. And so it takes a level of maturity to say, I might know some stuff, but I don't know everything. And I'm willing to learn that which I don't know as yet. It takes a level of maturity. And that's what we need to develop as we seek to be closer drawn to God, and as we seek to learn more. We need to become more mature in the faith. And that's a struggle. I agree with you.
Amen. It takes a mature person to say I was wrong. It takes a mature person to actually come to the table with a sincere motive to actually seek reconciliation and understanding. It takes a mature person to say, I didn't see it that way. I'm glad you brought that to my attention. Let's move forward together. And so that's the maturity I think the tribe in question exemplified, when instead of taking offense to how the Eastern tribes were about to, assume that they were bringing idolatry into the picture, they say, oh, I understand where they're coming from. And because we value unity, we're going to do whatever we can to ensure that they know that we're on the same page with them. So many times people say we need to be more unified, but there's no desire to actually reconcile or look at themselves in the mirror. There could be no unity without an acknowledgement of a problem. Even when you're in the therapist room, doesn't the therapist allow you or walk you through some kind of psychological issues that you have before there could be a pathway to working that thing out? Even when you go to the doctor's office, the doctor has to, conduct a series of standard tests and sit down with you and level with you about what you did wrong in your diet, or what you did wrong and how you conducted, how you took care of yourself before there could be a diagnosis, right? Even in the lawyer, in the court, in the lawyer's office, when you're at a consultation, the lawyer wants to know all the things that you did wrong, all the facts, and all the things that could possibly be used against you by the opposing side. So no matter what context we are talking, there has to be acknowledgement of wrongdoing. There has to be acknowledgement of what my role is in this before there could be steps towards progress. Amen. And so
you hit it, man. You hit it.
So as we conclude tonight, Israel doesn't avoid collapse because they were flawless. They avoid it because at the last possible moment, they choose curiosity over certainty, humility over accusation, conversation over condemnation. And that may be the most countercultural act of faith in the entire book, because unity, we discovered, isn't forged in shared enemies. It's forged in shared restraint. Anyone could rally when the walls are falling. Anyone could lock arms when survival demands it. But living together after the war, living generously, patiently, faithfully, that's where belief gets tested. And Joshua 22 reminds us that the promised land doesn't automatically produce promised people. You can cross the Jordan and still carry suspicion. You can worship the same God and still misjudge one another. You can fight side by side for years and still fracture over a rumor, which is why the Bible doesn't end with this story. It doesn't end the story with a theological lecture. It ends with a name. They call the altar witness, not because it proved who was right, not because it testified to something better. That misunderstanding doesn't have to become destruction. And that's the challenge for us tonight. In a church shaped by outrage cycles, ideological echo chambers, and instant conclusions, Joshua 22 dares us to practice a faith that slows down, a faith that asks before it accuses, a faith that listens before it labels, a faith that remembers unity is not maintained by suspicion, but by love disciplined by truth. I'm so grateful to have had this great and impactful and insightful discussion with Pastor Miles Young, Pastor Floyd White, and Pastor Kerwin Jones. Thank you, gentlemen, for what you brought to the table. This is going to conclude tonight's episode of the Escape Room Podcast. Thank you all for tuning in.